Okay, good morning, everyone. We are starting the first session. I am Professor Kushal Deb. I teach sociology in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences here at IIT Bombay. And I'm chairing the session, and Professor Surinder Jodhka would be speaking. I'll quickly read out a brief CV of his. Professor Surinder Jodhka is a professor of sociology at Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi, New Delhi. He researches on different dimensions of social inequalities, contemporary dynamics of caste, agrarian change, rural India, and the political sociology of community identities. His recent publications include The Indian Village, Rural Lives in the 21st Century, the Oxford Handbook of Caste, Indian Villages in the 21st Century, Revisits and Revisions, Mapping the Elite Power, Privilege and Inequality, a Handbook of Rural India, Caste in Contemporary India, Caste. He is the editor of the Routledge India's book series on religion and citizenship and co-editor of the OUP book series on exploring India's elite. He has been a recipient of the ICSSR Amartya Sen Award for Distinguished Social Scientists. So over to you, Surinder. We start 45 minutes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Kushal, and thank you, Anush, for asking me to do this. I remember when I got the invitation initially, Anush sent, and I read the concept note and the title, and I felt like I was not the person to be participating in this conference. I don't work on aspects of political economy as economists would understand the term, because I neither do politics nor do economics, nor do I do political economy in the manner in which the term is understood. But obviously, Anush is always very persuasive and very kind and very friendly. So he still wanted me to come, and he said, okay, will you be able to discuss some of the papers? Coming to IIT is always an honor, and I knew the many people who were organizing this conference. I immediately said, of course, yes, I will come. And then after a few days, I get this mail and saying that, would you give this keynote address? Again, at my age, it is not always very difficult to do keynote address, because keynote addresses are what in Punjabi we call as gapshap. So I think that's not something I would deny. And then he sent me some notes, and I read those notes, I think several times, and I also read the concept note several times. And I again felt like, I didn't know what to do. So finally, kind of, when your brain switches on, it kind of keeps producing some ideas. And suddenly I kind of thought that, yeah, maybe I can say this. So that's what I have put together. This is essentially gupshup in the sense that it's not well worked out paper. I don't know if it has potential of becoming written paper. I would kind of wait for your responses. But sometimes it kind of brings together some of the work that I've been doing over the years on the question of rural, on the question of caste, and also largely on the manner in which we visualize India, and particularly the question of social science categories. So this title, I thought today morning, maybe one can use this as way of talking about what I'm trying to say. And perhaps it would connect with some of the later presentations, but I do kind of would like to have your take on the way I've been thinking about these things and engaging with these questions. I have put the rural in plural, and that is kind of intentional. It's not a spelling mistake. I've been a social scientist formally for last 35 years. My first job was in 1990, so I can kind of claim that I have some idea about how sociology and social anthropology is done in India. We tend to kind of look at rural from three different lenses, as I've kind of come to understand. And this is not simply social scientists, but also the larger, what one would call as Indian society or popular imaginations but they also are part of the way Indian state or political regimes would think about India. And these three categories are village, caste, and agriculture. Not that these are the only ones, but they also, I mean, if you were to look at social science of 1950s or 1940s or even 1960s and 70s up to 1980s, they remain as the most critical categories through which social science in kinds of talks about India, or when a young student wants to kind of frame a PhD thesis topic, they would think about the village, they'll think about caste, they'll think about agriculture, agrarian change, and stuff like that. And this, at some level, also is embedded in a particular kind of tradition of doing social sciences. And that is my main focus. And when we look at the writings on Indian village, a long time back, I was in Oxford and I wrote this paper on From Book View to Field View, Social Anthropological Constructions of the Indian Village. And if you look at these writings, village is not simply a place out there. Village is seen also as a sui generis category. Those of you who are not familiar with people like Emil Durkheim, sui generis is used to describe something out there in a kind of concrete terms, like there is a bench there. It's a sui generis reality that if I try to walk through it, I will get hurt. So village was, in some sense, not only village, but it was also the Indian village. And among social science narratives, there is a particular imagination of the Indian village. And the Indian village is not like a village in Turkey or like a village in France or village in Thailand. Indian village is sui generis as Indian village because it has its very unique characteristics, because its social organization is caste. Agriculture is more kind of generic, and other places also, rural settlements will do agriculture. But it's also a kind of autonomous space. Its autonomy is taken for granted. Its politico-economic processes to have, in some sense, a very specific kind of autonomy internally. So when we talk about, say, for example, even in 1970s, when economists were doing debates on India's mode of production, what is the dominant mode of production in India, and they were talking about agriculture. Like agriculture is as if, it has an autonomy of its own, and in order to talk about agriculture, or India's mode of production, whether it is semi-feudal or capitalist, they would think about village. I mean, this would be scandalous in a classical Marxian framework. How could you think of mode of production of a society or of a country or of a region by looking at agriculture exclusively? So, but that was the way in which India was approached, that village is sui generis, village is autonomous, and its economic, political, social, cultural logic is limited to its boundaries, and one could talk about it as something which is different. But village was also at some level imagined at a much larger scale. All of us are familiar with Mahatma Gandhi, and Mahatma Gandhi is not the only one. Even people like Ambedkar, who were taking radical positions, they thought village was something very sui generis, and village represented what we call as the traditional India that has been around for a million years or centuries, and it has been more or less in the same shape. And this becomes then epitome of traditional India. And it was not confined only to traditionalists like Gandhians or nationalists like Nehru or radical thinkers like Ambedkar. Even the Marxist thinkers thought about village as a kind of sui generis category, and one could talk about its economy as if village economy was independent of everything else. So emphasis on its villageness also kind of suggests other things which have political implications for the present as we think about India today. And underlying assumptions being, when we think about village, we think about India. When M.N. Srinivas comes to study village, he's not studying a village. He's not studying a village in Mysore. He very conveniently and very intentionally gives it a name. And the village is named Rampura. It could have also been something else. Most likely, there are very few Rampura in Karnataka. but he chooses to name it Rampura. So what is the suggestion? And this is something that M.N. Srinivas and many others have written in detail, that village was a kind of methodological entry point to the study of Indian society. So when they were going to study village in 1950s, they were not studying a village, they were studying India. They were studying the larger social structure of Indian society and how it comes together. So village, in a sense, was a case study. It's like a doctor would do a study of a human body, and from that study you could generalize about how disease would spread in certain circumstances. So the India was at some level a land of villages. If you study village, you study India, and the social structure of India, village was caste, and caste again was over generalized as a Hindu institution. So the end of the story is that Indian village also becomes a Hindu village because caste is equal to being Hindu, and this obviously then also gets extended to an idea about a singular India which is all Hindu, which is all village, and which is hierarchical, but at the same time also united. That there is some system, there is some coherence to Indian life, and that in some sense produces Indian culture, and that Indian culture is Hindu culture, and that Hindu culture has been stable for centuries, for ages, and the place where you can observe it, where you can analyze it, where you can conceptualize it, is the village. So the village represented unity of India as a civilization, the word that is still used very popularly. So the social structure of Indian village is even though regionally distinct, they would study villages in different parts of the country. They would talk about, village has cluster of villages, but at the same time, they'll go back to the idea that villageness is very, very unique to India, and it represents a kind of social formation. It represents various other things. So along with village, there is also framing of caste, which is in some sense beyond the village. And this at some level overlaps with what I've just said, that the empirical life of caste, if you have to talk about empirical life of caste, the best place to observe it obviously is the village. And then it is conceptualized as the Hindu Jajmani system, not Jajmani system alone. Whenever you have discussion about Jajmani system, the word Hindu is added to it. Empirically, that's not true. I mean, earlier PowerPoint also, I'm saying these are narratives and constructs, and I'll come to their criticism. So the idea of Hindu Jajmani system is an imposition by the outsider on the local realities of caste. And so there are two levels at which caste is talked about. One is the empirical life of caste, where Yajman becomes the center, which is the person who owns land, and there are other communities which are dependent on him or reciprocally dependent on each other. And there is ideological life of caste. And these two narratives actually are very different, but they in some sense work together. And the ideological life of caste is the Varna hierarchy, is the Brahmanical Hinduism or Brahmanic Hinduism. And therefore, you have an imagination of India, which I think all of us still accept, and it becomes kind of a normal narrative about India, that caste is about village, village is about Hinduism, Hinduism is about caste, caste is about village, village is about Hinduism, etc., etc. But in this narrative of caste, what you find is absence of any discussion of agrarian, absence of any discussion of economic. And this is again very intentional, that when you think about India sitting in Paris or Göttingen or perhaps also in Chicago, you think of India as a cultural space. India's greatness lies in its traditions, its greatness lies in its Vedas and stuff like that. So as if Indians don't eat food. And somebody like Max Weber, when he talks about capitalism, he says that Hindus are otherworldly. So Hindus are all Indians, Indians are all Hindus believe in some kind of mythology which gives them moksha after death. So they are worried about what I call as the interlife mobility rather than intra-life mobility, and therefore they can't work hard and they can't produce capitalism. So the point is that the cultural notion of village, or the notion of village, the way it is conceptualized and theorized and studied empirically, represented by Indian anthropologists, is very culturalist, and the word civilization appears again and again. If you also look at the third foundational category that I was talking about, agrarian, it's very interesting that there are similar overlapping kind of framings of agrarian even in the so-called political economy literature or the Marxist literature. So the village studies tend to look at agrarian as an extension of the cultural. And when they're talking about cultural framing of agrarian economy, they are emphasizing on the community narrative, and there is a kind of normative consensus, and this is something that Karl Marx himself at some level accepts very uncritically, and then he's talking about India's village communities which have no private property and no sense of history, no sense of materiality, and they're all living in this kind of fictitious world of imaginations about the other life. So there is a kind of normative consensus around how agriculture should be talked about. If you look at the class framings of agrarian, the point I was trying to make, there is a reference to land, there is reference to classes of landowners, landlords, rich farmers, rich peasants, and labor. Labor is also materially talked about as processes of bondage and stuff like that. So there's plenty of literature on that, and in this literature, the Marxist literature, what you have is agrarian is seen as purely material and class process. What is missing in this is caste. And caste, when it comes, it is seen as superstructural, inconsequential for empirical study of caste. Mode of production debate, if you actually were to do content analysis of all the literature produced by economists and some also anthropologists in 1970s, you would find very few references to caste. Caste is virtually absent, and even if it is mentioned as something which is kind of hangover, and this would kind of, this doesn't really have a bearing on conceptualization of India's mode of production. So if you look at the underlying narratives, village is then also seen as site of tradition, but tradition is not simply our own history and culture. It also has other judgmental framings, and that is that it is backward. And the moment we call village as backward, that means it is also a site of deficit. There's something lacking there, which is economically it is stagnant, and villagers are conservative. These are all elite imaginations, elite judgments of India. But these elite judgments of India, they begin with the colonial period, but the nationalists internalize it very actively. And the backwardness is partly attributed to the nationalist, to the colonial exploitation, but it is also very actively, if you look at the discussions in the Indian National Congress meetings in 1920s and 30s, they very actively talk about conservativeness of Indian peasant, that Indian peasant is, even somebody like Nehru talks about how the peasant is almost stupid and comes out and prefers to die on the street rather than protest. So there is this imagination of Indian peasant being conservative, but at the same time, there is also within this conceptualization of village as being infantile, and this is a kind of much larger question which I have dealt with in my book on Indian village, which I actually presented here in IIT last year. This is not accidental. This is not something which is uniquely Indian. This has much bigger process, and that begins with the Orientalist imaginations of the East, but also they are embedded in the 19th century social science theories which emerge in Western Europe. Functionalism, modernization theory, Marxist class analysis, all of them unanimously, more or less, have this imagination of rural as being the pre-urban right? The fate of a rural is to become urban eventually, and therefore it is like the word development is a very good way of describing it. The child develops into an adult, right? Development is a process in a particular direction. It's a kind of teleological process of where the end would be. So village has no future, and it is good that village has no future. Village ought to grow up, and the growing up means that it should become adult. So as I said, that they're also embedded in Orientalist and colonial narratives about which a lot has been written and all of us know about it. And the very idea of Indian exceptionalism, as I said earlier, the village in India is not just the village in India. The village in India is the Indian village, which is unique to India. There are no other places where you have village. There's another very important question that in 1950s and 60s until 1990s, India lived in its villages, and there is cities absent, right? Which is actually very strange. I mean, historically speaking, India has always been urban. India has been rural, of course, but the cities in India, if you just go around, Bombay was perhaps set up by colonial rulers, but if you just go out, Pune was not a colonial city, Aurangabad was not a colonial city, Kolhapur was not a colonial city. Within Maharashtra, you'll have at least 24 urban centers which have been around for ages, right? They're as old as perhaps many villages would be, and perhaps 50% of the villages in Maharashtra will be not older than 200 or 300 years or 400 years, while the cities will be 1,000 or 2,000 years old. So, but if you look at the social science writing, it's not accidental. There are no urban studies, and Kushal is sitting next to me. There are occasional studies of neighborhoods in cities, but urban studies take off in the 1990s when India begins to think about itself very different. So here again, there is a kind of larger judgment, which is very problematic. The moment you talk about urban, you contrast it with the rural. Don't compare it with the rural. Contrast it with the rural. The urban is what is desirable because the urban is modern. Urban is industrial. Urban is educated. Urban is progressive. And most importantly, urban is free of caste. Urban has inequalities, but it doesn't have hierarchies, and the inequalities are of class. And everyone is hardworking and can experience mobility through education and hard work. So it's ever changing. So these framings of change obviously have a structure. They are not simply kind of random framings, as I've been saying, suggesting that the change is unidirectional. There is a particular way in which change is imagined, and this direction of change comes to us from the Eurocentric, West-centric imaginations of modernization. And that is that rural has to become urban, from traditional to modern, from religious to secular, from caste to class, from agrarian to industrial. So this is how economists would kind of then translate them into what one would call as indices of change. And if you score higher on the second side, that means you're more progressed, more developed. And if you score lesser on that, then you're less progressed. In the 1960s, modernization theories, in a sense, very crudely operationalized this idea of what were called as pattern variables. We teach them in sociology classroom even now. And becoming modern means all these things. Progressive also has a particular kind of self-congratulatory form. Now, what exactly is the rural? Where are we standing today? If you look at this table, and this is something which I have been presenting at many places, of course, India is changing. And if you look at the first row, percentage of urban settlements and urban population, that goes up. Urban population goes up from something like 26 millions to 377 millions in 2011. Now India is more than 400 millions urban. Now 400 million urban is not insignificant. The urban India is the largest demographics in the world except for China. It's the total population of India and China, right? So the total population of the third most populous country is less than 400 million, that is the United States of America. So the point I'm trying to make is that the Indian urban is huge. And actually, if you were to go back to the 17th century or 16th century, India was more urban than perhaps Europe was. I mean, we don't have hard demographics, but the estimate suggests that India's urban population was somewhere between 15 to 18% of the total population of the region we now call as India or South Asian subcontinent, which is much higher than the total population of Great Britain in the 17th, 18th century, right? So not that urban was missing. When they come to India, they come to Calicut. They don't come to a village, right? They come to many other urban centers which they are familiar with. And but actually, during the colonial period, India experiences ruralization. So the population that you have of urban, which is around 11% in 1901, it is lesser than the population that urban had in 200 years back. But even then, if you look at it, the urban population is growing, and it has now grown to around, say, around 34, 35%. We don't have census, as you know, but still it is significant. It's not just significant, it is actually massive, right? India's urban is 400 million plus. Not only that, population is higher. If you look at the Indian urban is the number of urban settlements is gone up from less than 2,000 to nearly 8,000, and now it would perhaps be even more. And urban population, as I said, is even more. Now just compare it with the other two columns. If you look at the rural, India's rural, we normally talk about 500,000, or there were 5,67,000 villages in 1901, and population of urban was nearly 90%, and now it will be around 65%. It has obviously come down, which means there is a process of urbanization. But if you look at the urban population today, right, it's around 90 crores, even could be more, right? It's 3 times of the rural population, right? And if you look at the trends, rural population has never declined. Absolute size of the rural population is consistently growing. And it's not only the absolute size of rural population is growing, number of rural settlements is also growing, right? From 5,67,000, we have 6,38,000. And even in those 10 years, the point I'm trying to make is that there are new villages coming up, right? Villages are not really a kind of closed chapter or declining chapter. Villages are coming up consistently, right? So the village is absolute is what that matters more than relative. And if you have large number of rural population, what are you going to do with it? Now, this is not unique to India, by the way, right? If you look at the global trends, I have this table, which I think I have data in my book from 1901. But even if you were to look at 1960 onwards, urban population is definitely growing. From 1 billion, it has gone up to now 4.5 billion or something like that. But if you look at the rural population is also growing, right? And the rural population today is more than it has ever been before, globally speaking, right? It's not just about India. There are more people living in rural areas than they have ever lived. And it has slowed down, the growth has slowed down, but if you look at between 2010 and 2020, rural population has increased, not declined, right? And it is only in 2007 or 8 that this kind of lines cross and urban population becomes more than rural population, right? So I'll try to wind up in next 5 to 10 minutes. So if you look at this reality, what I would call as the obvious conundrums, which are empirics of urban India, so the rural is persistent, and it's growing at a reasonably significant rate, even when the urban India has become the largest demographics, one among the largest demographics in the world today. Likewise, if you look at agrarian, Indian agrarian has obviously shrunk in terms of its value. But if in terms of its productivity, its contribution to workforce employment, and many other things, it remains huge, right? Agrarian, without agrarian, you can't think about India. I mean, it's like it's lost its influence, it's lost its power, about which I have kind of written elsewhere. And if you were to think of caste, which was supposed to go away with the urbanization process, it has actually become a much bigger reality today. Caste is everywhere. We talk about caste much more today than we ever did, right? Not that caste has not changed, not that caste has become more intensive as an experience, but it has become more intensive as an experience because of the mobilities, because of other processes. So the reality of caste is also structuring what we would call as modern processes. And about secularism, we don't even talk. Secularism has become, in some sense, a meaningless word, and it, in some sense, is not even on agenda of any political party today, perhaps. So all those parameters around which we kind of thought about India's change, India's modernization, India's progress do not really match with those theoretical formulations. So what could be the possible explanations, right? Possible explanations that India is a hopeless place, India remains the same as it changes, or it becomes worse than before. That is a typical middle class classroom cynical debate. And the second, again, middle classes would say that all this is happening because of our political class is so regressive and so kind of self-serving, and if India did not have democracy, India would have actually changed. And Indians have conservative mindset. I think all these explanations are known explanations. These are complete nonsense. I don't think India hasn't changed. I don't think caste hasn't changed. I don't think village hasn't changed. My own empirical research on caste, I've written this paper which has just come out in EPW on the futures of caste, where I've tried to summarize my work on caste. Today, caste is a very different reality, very different from what it used to be even 20 years back. Likewise, my work on rural very clearly shows that it is not the rural that it used to be even 20 years back. Agrarian also, we know that it's not something that. So what do we do? I mean, I think my own kind of take on would be that we need to, as I said, re-envisioning not only India, but also I think in sociology classrooms or social science classrooms, we have these courses called sociological theory, and then we talk about India. I think courses on sociological theory should be provincialized as studies of West European societies in the 19th century with a particular kind of political mindset. They are Eurocentric, West-centric. They do have some very useful conceptual frames for studying other societies, but they are not theories of societies. They are not theories of, when Talcott Parson is talking about social systems, he is actually talking about American society and the manner in which he wants American society to change. When Durkheim and Weber are talking about secularization, they're talking about France and Germany. They're not talking about the world. And they would perhaps have not claimed to be doing so. So I think the important thing is that we should recognize that these are 19th century conceptualizations of Western Europe, and they don't really have much to help to say as far as India is concerned. And these theories of functionalism and modernization, again, in functionalism, I find very useful categories like, structural differentiation, socialization, and many other things. But they are not theories of everything, right? Likewise, Marxist class determinism is equally problematic, right? And they are embedded in this binary of culture and materiality. And I think we need to move out of that binary and begin to look at the empirics as they present themselves to us. And we need to just kind of take away those lenses that we are wearing with lots of colors and distortions, and just get our eyesight checked again and see what myopic and numbers that we have, so that we can see things sharply. And if we see them sharply, then we kind of perhaps, I'm offering an alternative way of moving forward, which in some sense is suggesting that we should not look at village as a sui generis category. If it is not sui generis category, does that mean village does not exist? No, village exists. Village exists as a spatial formation. And there are multiple spatial formations, and villages have existed. They don't exist only in India. They exist in many parts of the world. They don't exist in India in a similar way. Spatial formations, which we call village, are regionally very diverse. If you go to Kerala, you have a different kind of rural spatiality, that you don't really have a village as you have in UP. These are contiguous settlements. In Maharashtra also, perhaps you would have 3, 5, 4 different kinds of rural settlements. Rural is a spatial formation. So the idea of village, which in some sense turns it into a sui generis singular category, should be rejected, and one should look at rural as a spatial formation, and as a spatial formation, it is a relational structure. As spatial formation, it emerges and stays and reconstitutes itself not internally but also by engaging with the wider world, right? And this is not something that is happening in the 21st century. This is something that was happening even in the 2nd century BC. And as an interactive process and as a spatial formation, it is reproduced within the regional political economy. And this is something that I'm trying to develop, that how do you draw boundaries of a region? One good way of thinking about region is language, right? Why do languages change? Within that language, people who were cultivators, they were producing their goods and they were traveling around, right? And they were traveling around in a region where they could communicate. And I think that's a good way of thinking about the village. And village as a regional spatial formation is constituted by the regional political economy, which has its center in the city, not in the village. And I think centering the city in order to understand village becomes very, very critical. And this, in some sense, gives us then a different perspective on engaging with the rural. Not that rural should not be studied. Rural should be studied as part of the regional social formation, and the regional social formation has a cultural process. It is also a language process. It is also a religious process. It is also a kind of other kind of customs and beliefs, and all those things are there. But it is also an economic process. I mean, if you look at the spice trade in Kerala would have structured regional political economy not only by interacting with the cultivating farmer who produces pepper and cardamom, but also the buyer in Britain and in Spain and in other parts of the world. And those relationships would have structured the local power structure and the local markets. So the agriculture has always been a market economy. Agriculture has never been localized. The moment agriculture comes, it becomes a global, industrial, urban kind of process. So we need to vision the very idea of agriculture as an economic process. And this brings me to kind of my final 2 slides, and that obviously is already suggested, that we need to reimagine the spatial, and spatial is historically evolved, where village and city co-evolve. They are not like, first comes the village and then the village gets urbanized. It's because of the settled agriculture that you have possibility of an elite emerging, and that elite in some sense then moves away from the site of production and forms a kind of urban settlements. And there are no universal patterns of spatial evolution. Spatial evolutions can happen in very different ways. They are shaped through human agency and economic contingencies. Human agency becomes very, very critical. They are not like structural processes like, an amoeba evolving into something else, or a seed turning into a plant and into a tree, but they are also agential, cultural, political processes, and imaging them as political projects where agencies like, colonial power becomes very, very critical, in the manner in which, like a lot of literature now, that the very idea of Jajmani system actually evolves in the 19th century in response to colonial policies. It wasn't an ancient reality, and how the nationalist elite finds it very convenient, and then it in some sense begins to think of village as a colony of the urban elite, and the urban elite would decide what is good for you. And this is something that we saw during the farmers' movement. And economists sitting in Delhi were telling farmers, "You're stupid. You don't know what is good for you. We are telling you what is good for you, and you're not accepting." And obviously, nationalism also has a complicated relationship with the spatial imaginations. So both urban and rural are shaped by also local ecologies. Again, as I said, Kerala has a very different kind of spatial formations. And if you go to hills of Himachal Pradesh, rural settlements are very tiny, and they have implications because there are no houseable plots, and global capital processes, they are also shaping our spatial formations. They are not random, and I can perhaps, they are structurally and functionally integrated and differentiated through logic of power and economy and capital. They are shaped by social political dynamics of caste, class, and community. So caste also needs to be seen as a material. I have again, as I said, written on it, and I can give a separate lecture on materialities of caste. But how caste and class are not simply mutually constitutive. These are, analytically speaking, both material and both cultural processes, and they embed each other. And this is something that, again, I don't agree with, and this is something that I've already written, and one can talk about it. And they're also influenced by global economy. And once the nation state comes into being, that is another reality which then begins to shape the rural through programs of development, state support, and things like that. So just kind of, I have another 2-3 minutes? Yeah. So if one was to be more specific, that how could one reimagine caste? For me, caste is a kind of social and cultural construct. It's, again, not a sui generis reality. The word caste is not an Indian term, right? Again, I've written on it, and I can talk about it in greater detail. Caste is a Western word. It's a European word, right? And when it comes to India, not that caste does not exist in India or caste did not exist in past, but the moment the word caste comes to us through the colonial narratives, it also then becomes something else. That from a local structure of hierarchy, caste begins to be imagined as a national process which is uniquely Indian and which is uniquely Hindu, which it is not, right? I say that in 1947, on 14th of August, caste existed in Lalpur and Rawalpindi. On the 15th of August, caste disappeared from Rawalpindi and Faisalabad, right? It's because they don't have the narratives of caste. We have narrative of caste, and we continue to work with caste, right? Caste, the word exists in Europe, and it still exists in Europe in some ways. And I know, in Italy, professors are called a caste. And it is not by accident. And there's plenty of literature on inequality, which is now talking about. So the reality of caste as a cultural and material process needs to be detached from Brahmanic Hinduism. Not that Brahmanic Hinduism is not very critical. Brahmanic Hinduism provides an ideological signal which legitimizes hierarchies, right? But in my religion, Sikhism, which is kind of ideologically, aggressively against caste, caste is there. So there is no ideological signal, but caste as a structure exists. And caste as a structure exists in Pakistan. It flourishes in Pakistan. And even though there is no Manusmriti there is no Hinduism there. So one has to kind of look at this relationship between Manusmriti or Brahmanic Hinduism and the everyday life of caste, which are not the same thing, right? So everyday life of caste is very different from Brahmanic Hinduism. Not that Brahmanic Hinduism has no implications for everyday life of caste, but this relationship needs to be empirically engaged with also its ideological justification. More importantly, castes are regional processes. As I said, it's only with the colonial narratives that you have a national narrative of caste because of colonial census, because of colonial policies, and more importantly, after that, nationalist elite finds it very convenient, and also it is institutionalized through constitution. The moment you have scheduled caste quotas for Hindu Dalits, then it also has a different kind of motivation, and it requires a different meaning and different kind of life about which we already know. And it's historically, already suggested that, colonial rule. But before colonial rule also, if you look at Divyacharyan's work on Rajasthan, how even a Muslim was considered as untouchable. My mother also used to tell me in Layalpur, where we lived, that how Muslims were untouchable. So the kind of dynamics of relationship of caste were very, very region specific. And if you look at Kerala, the realities of gender and caste in Kerala have been very different. The Mudri-Nayar relationship, it doesn't fit anywhere else. So if you have to talk about caste in Kerala, you have to have the history of Kerala and history of Kerala sexuality, history of Kerala hierarchies of power. And without that, you can't make sense of Nayar-Nambudri relationship. And this is very unique to Kerala. It doesn't apply anywhere else. Only Nambudri women were allowed to wear upper cloth, and Nayar women were not even allowed to wear upper cloth. So this is something which kind of is within the dominant caste groups. So it's very specific to regional histories, and it obviously changes, and caste as a comparative conceptual category can help us understand inequalities and hierarchies in other contexts. Again, this is something bigger. Likewise, agrarian can also be seen as a different process. Agrarian is a socially and regionally embedded economic process, like all other economic processes. They're historically taking. We need to reject the notion of progress as disappearance of agrarian, and there are plural agrarians, diverse trajectories of change. The idea of caste agrarian in place of peasant economy. This is the point I'm making, that Marxist, everyone uses the word peasant. I think the word peasant doesn't apply to India. What we have had is caste agrarians, and caste agrarians means that we did not have peasant societies like Central Europe has, which every cultivator has a couple of acres of land which they cultivate with their family labor. India, even in the 5th century, half of the population was not allowed to touch the plow. So what we need to replace the word peasant economy and peasant society is with what I call as caste agrarian. And agrarianism is also, in a sense, ideological process. Sorry if I have taken a little longer than 1 minute longer. Thank you so much, Kushal. And it's
So I am Somdeep. I am from Sitara, Center for Technology Alternative for Rural Area, and I study GIS, remote sensing, this kind of thing. This subject of the spatial formation always fascinated me, but you have bring that language dimension to it. But language is a dynamic process. It's like a river. Now what we are speaking is a different language than the past. So how you will incorporate this temporal change? Because language, people go otherwhere, and the language changes also. So how you are seeing that historical, that's very fascinating. And one thing, you said that agrarians lost power and lost power to somewhere else. You have written about something. Can you please that paper? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, sir. Yes, two observations about your lecture. It was a fascinating one. One is about the caste agrarian. So even though people don't have access to land, there are these structures of rent which mediate access and cultivation. So hence, why not resort to the term peasant instead of something else? Because differential rent is something which is operational even in India. And secondly, Omiyo Bakchi's critique of Deepesh Chakraborty's idea, where he says in EPW that even in provincial Bengal, things are provincial. So then what kind of a sociology do you desire, or do you think is possible? Because if we are talking about two pedagogies, one in Europe and one in India, then is there no scope for any unification methodologically?
Good morning, sir. I have learned about you in my Indian sociology while preparing for UPSC. Sir, especially Green Revolution and effect of it in Punjab. Sir, then what do you think, sir? Should we launch Green Revolution second phase? And especially in those areas where the Green Revolution first was not launched.
Thank you so much for your lectures. Yes, about the language thing, see, I'm talking about two things here. One is that if we have to think about rurals in past, for example, when say in the 19th century, in the 18th century, even in the 21st century, I was just thinking about what would be the alternative way of imagining the rural, right? One possible way is to think of rural as a spatial formation embedded in the regional formation, right? But that doesn't exhaust it. Another word that I use is the historicity of that spatial, what one should say, constellation. The spatial is not a singular reality. Spatial is a constellation. There would be villages, towns. Again, it would vary. I remember I was doing my fieldwork in Solan district, and this panchayat sarpanch, after a long interview, said, "Chaliye saab, हम आपको अपना constituency दिखाते हैं." And I said, "You are a panchayat sarpanch. What do you mean by constituency?" He said, "Chaliye saab." So he kind of took me in his jeep, and there were 50 different settlements which together made one panchayat, right? So spatial is a constellation, and these constellations are also historically connected. As I said, in case of Kerala, which is producing spices, the farmers are producing spices or whatever, cultivators or peasants, whatever you like to call them, in some remote place near Calicut. But that is related to the trade that is taking place through whatever Arabic traders with Europe, right? So this constellation, spatial constellation, and that would have implications for this. So you're right. I mean, that is one arbitrary way of marking agrarian spatial formations, and that is to think of region. How do you think of region? Not as Maharashtra and Gujarat and Punjab. Think of regions as regions where people traveled frequently. And where did they stop traveling? Where the language changes, right? So this is a region in which they can comfortably commute, but it's not fixed. And you're absolutely right that these constellations can change, and they would have changed. And see what we make a distinction between dialect and language. Dialect is a way you can't really speak the same language, but you understand each other. So there would be peripheral regions. So this is a very interesting area to study, that how these regions, some of them would have expanded, some of them would have shrunk, right? Some of them would have become part of the larger regions, right? They would also start speaking different languages, right? This is something that we can empirically see happening today also in different, after the nation states come again, there is a different ways in which these regional cultural boundaries are reworked. So you're right. I mean, I agree with you. Lost power to home. I have a paper called Beyond Crises. Actually, I've shared 5 papers which I think will be given to the participants, and one of those is that. Now there are two classes to whom the village has lost power. One is the agrarian rich who has seceded from the village. See, Sharad Pawar no longer lives in the village, right? Or Chotalas no longer live in the village. Badals no longer live in the village. They were the ones who emerged from the village as agrarian bourgeoisie or agrarian dominant interests in the 1960s, but their next generation has moved to the city. And that's how I wrote a paper, I think it was the same thing, paper that I initially titled as Who Will Speak for the Village? So village has no agency. And partly the reason why village has lost agency is the spokesperson of the village has himself, and it is always male, has seceded from the village, has moved to the city, right? So the village is left with a kind of small cultivators who are also from OBC and Dalit castes. So its influence in the larger universe has lost. Second, obviously, is the corporate capital. Corporate capital wants to, that's why the farmers' movement are going on Punjab. The corporate capital wants to subsume agrarian also within the logic of corporate market economy. And they are still resisting. Only people resisting are farmers of Punjab because they still have large holdings. compared to farmers in Bihar or perhaps also Maharashtra, where holdings have shrunk. So there are different dynamic power processes. These are still underway. But the fact that agriculture has shrunk economically, agriculture has lost politically is without any doubt. And you can look at economic policies. We have 70% people living in rural areas, but the elite, if you look at the demographics of social background of elite which sit in parliament, there are very few of them who are from villages. And we recently did a survey of big wealth in India. Entire big wealth, people who own more than 100 crores, Riona will be present in more than 100 crores, none of them is a villager, right? We used to think about village landlords. All urban wealth in India today all big wealth in India today is urban. And this is empirical statement. I'm not judging. Yes, caste, agrarian, rental structure, you can talk about it. You're right. I mean, at some level. Yeah, precisely. I'm coming to that. You can use the word peasant because leftists have popularized it so much that we can't think about agrarian without thinking about peasant. So even if you look at the rental arrangements, again, there is not one India. There are India where perhaps peasant societies did exist historically, right? The small cultivators with small owners. But in most places, what you have is the caste agrarians. Like Dalits would perhaps, only now that these rental arrangements have started, until 30 years back, no one will lease out their land to Dalits because there were other people who were takers, and giving land to Dalits, people would mistrust that this person cannot cultivate land. So it's a recent process with capital coming into agriculture, and reverse tenancy has become very popular, and because the so-called dominant caste people, they don't want to do farming and stuff like that. So yeah, there are provincial processes. I grant that there would be regional formations that one can understand. Green Revolution, second Green Revolution is kind of outside the scope of this presentation. But technology is not something that we can escape, right? Agriculture has to also have technology, and agriculture has always had technology. It's not like there is anything called organic farming. This is a myth created by the middle class, right? There were different kinds of technologies. There were technologies of irrigation. Yes, certain kind of fertilizers were better for health, and now you have corporate capital coming in and asking us to feed feed land with poisons, which we now call as poisons. But there could be future technologies which are not bad as so. I think agriculture should not be technology averse, but it should also look at sustainability, both in terms of land, but also in terms of requirements. People very easily criticize Green Revolution, but after 1950s, India has not had any famines. We don't have food scarcity, right? There are many things about Green Revolution which are misrepresented because that has become fashionable. Not that I am justifying pesticides and use of pesticides, because corporate capital has come in and so one can't really say that agriculture should have nothing to do with technology. That is romanticism. As if farmers don't want to have, they also want to be mobile, they also want to use. So the point is that all technology should be socially audited. And if there is no social audit of technology, then corporate capital will anyway kill us, and they're already on the verge of eliminating humanity, and I don't know how long will we survive. So.
In urban areas, so the nature of rural has also changed. And to what extent do you think that absolute increase is because of the changing nature of rural itself?
Two very quick questions. So related to the previous question. So the first one was, in your paper, you connected the village to the region and you connected the region to language. So my question was, we have a long history of migration between regions and to the rural, and thinking about something like the migration of Bihari agricultural labor to Punjab and UP. We've had that since 1975. So how can we develop a sort of methodology of the rural which takes that migration into account? And my second question is, to what extent is the village now industrial in a way. I mean, we know that certain villages, the sorting of scrap, migrant workers, railway workers live in villages. We also have phenomena like the Maruti factory in Manesar has captured a number of villages. So how can we think of it as not just agricultural but industrial? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, the two questions are related. Agrarian population is not increasing. Rural population is increasing, right? Larger number of people living in rural areas are employed in non-farm work. Now, this non-farm is also a kind of distinction created by economists who actually don't go to the village. Invariably, some of them do. I'm not saying all of them. But this whole thing about non-farm as something which has come up recently is actually not true, right? Indian rural has always been also non-farm, right? All these numbers that agriculture economists or NSSO states that, there were 80%, 90% people employed in agriculture. Now it has come down to 45%. I think it needs revisiting. Right? People who say that, haan ji, kheti karte hain, it doesn't mean that they actually do agriculture, right? They actually do other things. If somebody is a carpenter, somebody is shopkeeper. We also have this notion of Jajmani system where people were doing different occupations. Agriculture was done only by people who actually had land, and some of them would also help them seasonally, occasionally, or regularly, or whatever. So I think we need to have a different view of rural occupations. But at the moment, my own feeling is that people who are employed in agriculture, their number has come down very significantly. We did some field work in Madhubani, Bihar, and Madhubani is a region which has only 6% urban population in 2011. And in Madhubani villages, 11 to 12% rural households were employed exclusively in agriculture. Only 12% rural per household employed exclusively in agriculture. So there are lots of people living in rural areas, they are employed in urban areas, they go back to the village, that's where they live, or they live in village and have income from non-farm economy, or they are pluriactive. They have small plot of land which they cultivate, but their primary source of income or a significant source of livelihood comes from non-farm economy. So to equate rural with agrarian is very problematic. Agrarian is an aspect of rural, but agrarian is also more than rural, right? So rural is much more than agrarian, and agrarian is much more than rural. And this is something which is kind of a little complicated, but empirically one can easily work it out. And this is also part of these simplistic notions. So if we have to talk about agrarian, we should talk about agrarian as an economic process, how far it is spread, who comes from outside. And this is connected with migrant labor. When migrant labor comes from Bihar, the migrant labor doesn't come to the village. Migrant labor comes to the agrarian, right? They cultivate, they harvest the crop, and then they go back. So the agrarian, even as a labor process, is integrated in the larger economy across regions, right? So I think that's where we need to reconceptualize labor migrations. So agrarian labor process is not village-centric. It perhaps never was. Even earlier, when harvesting would happen of fruits, labor would come from all around, right? So the labor process of agrarian is not village-centric. Labor process of agrarian is a much larger process which keeps changing. And this is not something which is confined to Indian village. In California also for harvesting, people will come from Mexico and stuff like that. So labor processes of agrarian need to be conceptualized differently, and that at some level. So at some level, one can then think of migration very differently. Migration is not simply one-way process. Migration is many-way process. So it's related to what in Kerala there is conceptualization, migration-induced migration. So there are lots of migration happening into Kerala because Kerala labor is migrating out to Gulf, right? So there are whole migration circuits which kind of have independent logic and independent dynamics, and it's not reducible to just labor coming in and labor going out. How is village industrial? Yes, I mean, again, this is a very interesting question. What has happened is when I was writing this book on Indian village, So the industry in village is industry in village because lots of industrialists want to install their industry outside the city because land is cheaper there, but it gets registered as rural industry, which it is not, right? So most of the labor force that works there has nothing to do with the local village. Some of the local labor might come and work in the factory that has been put there, but it is because of the urban laws and stuff like that. There are areas where you can, so there are complicated regional processes. State governments also have laws that these are areas where you can install industry. So the lot of industry is going out of city into villages, which would be called as villages, but villages are not getting industrialized, right? There are villages which are being influenced by this industry, which is urban capital, which is expanding itself beyond the boundaries of the city, but it is not a process of rural industrialization. Non-farm economy in rural is mostly shops and petty trade and stuff like that. What we studied in Bihar. This paper is published in EPW if you want to look at it.
Thank you, Surinder. Thank you, everybody. We need to close this session. I think we'll have a break.